The focus of this lecture, State and Church in the High Middle Ages 1000 to 1300, is state versus church, or power struggles between various kings around Europe and the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the popes. As we've talked about in previous lectures, popes were very reluctant in the Middle Ages to give up any of their power and influence over Europe. And we see a couple of examples of state versus church in the early Middle Ages. We begin with a power struggle between the church, the papacy, and the state, the Holy Roman Empire. Pope Gregory VII reigned as Pope of the Roman Catholic Church from 1073 to 1085, and he believed that papal authority was absolutely supreme in Europe, that there was no individual more powerful in Europe than the Pope. The Pope claimed to be the ultimate power in Europe because, as he pointed out, all Europeans were Christians. When the Pope looked across Europe, he didn't see English men and women, French men and women, German men and women, Italian men and women. He just saw Christians. So, as Pope Gregory points out, since all people in Europe are Roman Catholic, he is the most powerful man in Europe. Everyone listens to him. He is the spiritual leader of all of Europe. These little political divisions into England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, that stuff doesn't matter. First and foremost, people are Christians. So, looking out across Europe, thinking about the problems that faced the church, Pope Gregory VII focused in on one problem, and it was a problem called lay investiture. This was a practice that allowed political leaders to appoint church officials. For example, if there was a vacancy in the Holy Roman Empire, an archbishop died, it had been traditional practice that if the Pope wanted to, he had first choice of who to put in that position, but popes had gotten so busy by this point they couldn't appoint every single person to every single job. So they had allowed political leaders to do that. For example, if an archbishop died in the Holy Roman Empire in a particular part of Germany, say Bohemia or whatever, the Holy Roman Emperor would be given some possible candidates for the position, and he would choose. Usually someone who was, in fact, devout and religious, but many times these kings across Europe would appoint men that were their friends to these jobs so that they would have some influence and control over the church, always having the church support. If all of the members of the church hierarchy in a particular country were appointed by the king of that country rather than the pope, those individuals would be loyal to the king instead of the pope. They would be willing to throw church support behind the king rather than the pope. So this had led to a bit of corruption within the church. Yes men who saw themselves as inclined and more likely to support the king who had given them the job than the Pope who is in Rome far away. So in 1075, Pope Gregory VII outlawed the practice of lay investitures. Okay, it's going to be overwhelming amount of responsibility for me to select every single person for every job in the Catholic Church, but I'm willing to do it to get rid of the corruption in the church. Well, this aggravated and upset many political leaders across Europe who liked the idea of having that kind of control and influence in the church that lay investiture had given them. So one of the guys who stepped out here into the forefront to challenge Pope Gregory VII was the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Henry IV was very upset about lay investiture being outlawed and taken away from him. What results is an argument between the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, who reigned from 1056 to 1106, and Pope Gregory VII, who reigns from 1073 to 1085 as the Pope of the Church. This argument is typically referred to as the Gregorian Revolution, papacy versus the Holy Roman Empire. So, what are these guys arguing over? The issue is lay investiture, so they say. But really the issue is power and influence. Who is more powerful? Is it Henry IV or is it Gregory VII? These two men exchange a series of letters arguing with each other about the pros and cons of the practice of lay investiture. The letters become increasingly heated, each man growing more and more agitated. Henry IV fires off a letter to the Pope in which he calls him, quote, not Pope, but false monk. Now, you may not understand exactly what that means. What Henry IV is doing here is he's calling Pope Gregory a fake. Now, what on earth would he be calling the Pope a fake for? What does that mean? Well, from a previous lecture, you'll remember that when a man achieves the status of Pope in the Roman Catholic Church, he's had a lifetime of service and commitment to the Church. He has sworn the Benedictine oath of celibacy, of poverty, of putting church above everything else. What Henry IV was saying here is, where do you get off criticizing controversy, corruption in the church, when you yourself are controversial and corrupt? And what he's pointing out in particular is that Pope Gregory VII was extremely rich. He had many palaces and was a very wealthy and materialistic man. So to be called out like this was very upsetting for Pope Gregory, and he more or less was upset by this probably because the truth hurt. So he sent notification back to Henry IV that because of his statements and because of his unwillingness to compromise on the issue of lay investiture, he, Henry IV, was now excommunicated from the church. Excommunication means that Henry IV is cut off from the church. He's a social outcast. He can no longer go to church functions. If he becomes sick or is dying and sends for a priest cannot come to him and administer last rites. That means that Henry IV would die in a state where his soul had not been forgiven of sin, and according to Catholic teachings at the time, this would mean that Henry would either go to purgatory, sort of a way place between a waiting station between heaven and hell for God to decide where you would ultimately end up, or if he was particularly bad and wasn't forgiven of his sins, he would end up in hell. So this is a big deal to be excommunicated. And at first, when Henry IV was excommunicated in 1076, he was so angry that it didn't really dawn on him the repercussions of his excommunication. He's so angry at first that how dare he excommunicate me, that he doesn't think, ooh, I'm excommunicated, that means I could go to hell or purgatory or whatever. So eventually, after the anger subsides, worry begins to set in, and Henry IV feels that he has no choice but to seek out the Pope and ask for forgiveness. So in 1077, over 3 days in a blisteringly cold blizzard, at the Pope's winter palace, Canossa, northern Italy, Henry IV stands in the snow in this blinding, blistering blizzard for 3 days, begging forgiveness before the Pope finally concedes to forgive him. So in 1077, Henry IV is humbled. He stands in the snow in a blizzard for 3 days, begging for forgiveness. This certainly seems to prove what Pope Gregory felt about himself, that he was the ultimate authority in all of Europe. He had humbled this guy, Henry IV. So at the end of the 3 days, Since Christianity is all about forgiveness, the Pope has no choice but to forgive Henry IV, but he gives him a stern warning. I'm lifting this excommunication off of you, but you need to be very, very aware that you are no longer allowed to appoint people to the Catholic Church. Lay investiture is still outlawed, and you must respect that. Henry IV at this point is in a very compromising and conciliatory mode here, and he says, sure, whatever, just please forgive me, let me go, let me be a part of the church, I'm sorry, whatever you say goes. So, this lasted for a while. The fear of the excommunication kept Henry walking a straight path for a while, trying to do right, trying to stay on the good side of the Pope, allowing the Pope to appoint members to the church without interference from Henry. But eventually, as they got farther and farther away from the excommunication, Henry began to forget a little bit about the fear and the uncertainty of being excommunicated, what it had meant, and he started arguing with the Pope again. By 1080, Henry IV was excommunicated, and this time the Pope levies on the Holy Roman Empire, that is, the subjects of Henry IV, are given an interdict. That means they too are effectively excommunicated. What the Pope is attempting to do here is to incite rebellion against Henry IV. These individuals who lived in the Holy Roman Empire, that's Germany and part of Italy, these individuals are now upset with their emperor, with their king. You know, it was bad enough that Henry IV had gotten himself in an argument that led to his excommunication, but the people are now outraged. You've gotten us involved in this also. We don't want to be excommunicated because of your argument with the Pope. So Henry's subjects sided with the Pope. Strangely, many of the Catholic Church officials sided with Henry IV in this argument. And that's because they probably wanted to see the Pope's power lessened a little bit. Also, you know, he was their boss, so they wanted him to be taken down a notch or two. So, in this difficult situation, Henry has a choice to make. What to do about this? He's not going to be excommunicated. He's not going to allow this interdict to be on his subjects. What to do? He makes a startling decision. He invades the city of Rome, and he sends his knights, men who are pledged to serve him no matter what, to capture the Pope. Now you can imagine these knights, who are devout Christians, do not want to capture the Pope. That just seems awfully wrong. Like if you capture the Pope and you kill him or something, you just go straight to hell for that or something. You know, this is not a job they want. So they would always report to Henry, we almost had him, he got ahead of us at the last minute. They more or less followed Pope Gregory around from safe house to safe house, allowed him to stay a few steps ahead, always just out of their reach. Well, this ultimately resulted in Gregory's exile. He had to move farther and farther and farther out of Rome. And being an elderly man already in poor health, this constant stress and moving about ultimately led to the death of Pope Gregory. Now, unfortunately, in 1085, Gregory dies. That does not automatically lift the excommunication or interdict off of the Holy Roman Emperor and his subjects. That is done by Pope Gregory's successor. So Henry IV then leaves Rome. But the issue of lay investiture still remains. Will lay investiture remain outlawed? Will that decision be reversed so that political leaders across Europe can again appoint people to the Catholic Church? What's going to happen with that issue? Well, the issue of lay investiture was not solved in either man's lifetime. Pope Gregory was not alive to see this issue solved. Neither was Henry IV. In 1122, in a German city called Worms, spelled like worms but pronounced Worms, a meeting is held and is called the Concordat of Worms. Political and religious leaders get together to discuss the issue of lay investiture, and it is decided in 1122 that lay investiture is outlawed. This seems like a victory for the church, that the church has won this church versus state argument over lay investiture. But not exactly, because what comes out of the Concordat of Worms is this: lay investiture is outlawed. Political leaders, or lay authority as it's called, can no longer appoint church officials, but they can veto nominees. So if you really get what that means, this is not truly a solution to the problem. What they've set up in 1122 at the Concordat of Worms is a power struggle. Who is going to win? Will it be a pope or a king? In other words, they haven't solved the issue at all. They've just put something on paper here. What they've done is they've put on paper what was happening anyway. If a king doesn't like one of the Pope's nominees for a position to that king's country, okay, let me explain what I mean here. Say you got an English king. Archbishop of Canterbury in England dies. Pope says lay investiture no longer exists. I'm choosing that person. This is my nominee for that job. The King of England could veto that nominee. The Pope says, okay, how about this person? Nope, don't like him either. Veto. Veto. Nominee. Veto. Nominee. Veto. And this could go on and on and on until one of these individuals, the Pope or the King, finally gives in. So the Concordat of Worms does not solve anything. One last example of church versus state in the early Middle Ages for you, and then we'll be done with this discussion, is going to take us to England, actually. And I'm going to do this rather quickly. I just want to give you another little idea of what church versus state was like in this period. The next example of church versus state is from England. King Henry II reigned from 1154 to 1189 and is famous for a couple of things. He would be the father of the famous English kings, Richard the Lion-Hearted, who would lead the country of England on the Third Crusade. Richard would be succeeded by his brother, John, son of Henry II. It is King John who is so terribly unpopular that the legend of Robin Hood develops, of this champion hero of the poor stealing from the rich so that they can pay John's harsh taxes. He's also famous, Henry II, not just for his sons Richard and John, but also for adding Ireland to English territory. And he also starts trial by jury. Now this is a great development, something we take for granted, having charges presented against us and being tried by a jury of our peers, but that comes to us from Henry II. But before Henry II comes up with trial by jury, the English had been using a leftover from ancient Mesopotamia, and that was trial by ordeal, either river ordeal or fire ordeal. So trial by jury is a major advancement. What we want to talk about here with Henry II is his struggle with the church. Now, I should point out to you that Henry II considered himself to be a very religious man, a devout Catholic. However, he was quite the partier. He was a heavy drinker and a womanizer. And he had started out his youth with an enemy, a man named Thomas Becket, who was a competitor of sorts. Henry II and Thomas Becket had a tendency to have parties on the same night, and it was just coincidental, but both gave just great parties, and people had to decide, oh gosh, which one do we go to? Do we go to Henry's or do we go to Becket's party? And so these two guys were kind of competitors on the party scene. They were also competitors for women. They had their eyes on some women in common, and they also had been sort of rivals in archery and that kind of stuff. And, eventually Henry and Becket realized that they had more in common, which is why they were rivals. They liked to party, they liked to drink, they liked to womanize, they liked to hunt. So rather than being rivals, why not just try to team up and be friends? So Henry and Becket become best of friends, buddying around, hunting together, drinking, partying, womanizing together. When Henry II became King of England, he knew immediately he was going to do something for his buddy Becket as soon as he got the chance. Well, this chance presented itself. The Archbishop of Canterbury died. This was a powerful position in the Church of England. So, we know from the 1122 Concordat of Worms that it's up to the Pope to make a suggestion, and if Henry didn't like it, he could veto the nominee. So we go through this process, and Thomas Becket is eventually agreed upon by Henry II and the Pope as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas Becket was reluctant to take this job initially. He was a partier, after all. He was not a man known for his church going, for being devout or very religious, but the job was so awesome because it was such a powerful position, and he would have a lot of influence over people, and it came with a big salary, and he would be a big shot. So yeah, he agreed to take the job. And it's one of the weirdest things. Historians have tried to explain what happens to Becket, and it really just kind of defies explanation. But when Thomas Becket became the Archbishop of Canterbury, it's like he immediately experienced some sort of transformation. He turned over a new leaf, so to speak. He became extremely religious and devout, and is often the case with someone who's been a big sinner. Becket becomes a very self-righteous Christian. Almost hard to be around, especially for Henry II. Henry tries to get Thomas Becket to go out with him, to continue to party and womanize with him, and Becket points out, can't do this. It doesn't fit my position now. I have a certain kind of behavior that is expected of me. I can't act like that anymore. Thanks, but no thanks. And it's very hard for Henry II to see this change come over Becket. It's not what he intended at all. When he got Becket this job, he figured that Becket would enjoy the power and influence and the money, but he would remember that he had the job because of his friend Henry. And whenever Henry said, I have this new law or new tax and I want the church's support on it, he would go to Becket, and Becket would say, yes, Henry enjoys church support. The church feels that this is the right thing for him to do, but it didn't work out this way at all because of Becket's transformation. So it's almost like Henry keeps testing Becket's friendship, and he asks him, would you go ahead and, since I have so many illegitimate sons and only a couple of legitimate sons, would you go ahead and coronate for me Richard? Now, no, that's not tradition. I'm supposed to die before Richard is coronated, but he points out to Becket, I've been a womanizer, and so I have all of these illegitimate kids out there, and I don't want there to be any problem for Richard to succeed me. Well, Becket says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to coronate Richard, your son, as your heir before your death, because that's not the way it's supposed to work. So Henry is outraged. He's aggravated. What? How dare you? Why not? We're friends, blah, blah, blah. Becket says, no, it's not right. I'm not going to do it. They also get into an argument over what's called benefit of clergy. Let me explain what that means. In England, a church official who was accused of a crime could be tried either in a royal court, that is, a court that was overseen indirectly by the king, or by a church court. if you were a church official, you wanted to be tried in church court because the punishment was much more lenient. For example, in royal court, punishment for stealing or thievery could be castration. In a church court, it would be something like saying so many prayers, volunteering for community service, doing charity work, giving bread to the poor, etc., etc. So, given the option of castration or charity work, it seems like a no-brainer. So, church officials, when accused of a crime, wanted to be tried in church court. And there were a couple of occasions where church officials got in trouble, and Henry wanted to put them in royal court, and Becket reminded him, no, we have quote-unquote benefit of clergy. They're going to be tried in church court. And it's almost like Henry just can't wrap his mind around the idea that Becket is a changed man and he's trying to do things according to the rules of the church. So Henry continues to issue invitations. Becket continues to reject him. This ultimately blows up into a heated debate between the two, and they become enemies over the issue of benefit of clergy. And it was recommended to Becket that he might need to go away for a while for his own safety before Henry possibly would react violently against him. So Becket went to France for a while. Henry got to missing him, thinking about old times, sought Becket out in France. The two had a reunion. They got along well for the first 30 minutes to hour of seeing each other, and then Henry brought up the issues of coronation of his son, benefit of clergy, and they started to argue again. Henry left, angry, agitated. Becket cannot be reasoned with. He goes back to England in a fury. Becket goes back to England, decides he's not going to be intimidated by Henry. He's going to do his job the best that he can. And when news starts to spread that Becket had stood up to Henry II and refused to compromise, he gained a great deal of respect and popularity. And Christians began to turn out to hear his sermons that he was preaching in his church there at Canterbury. And his popularity soared, and he was an extremely popular figure. Henry watches all of this with a great deal of distaste. How is this possible that he is popular and I am not, etc., etc.? And on one occasion, on 12/29/1170, Henry II could no longer contain his aggravation and agitation with Thomas Becket. He was surrounded by his knights. These are men who are pledged to be his fighters, his supporters. And Henry says, quote, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome monk?" The knights took this to mean, kill Becket. That's our order. Henry later denied that that's what he meant, but it was too late. The knights left, found Becket just as he was about to deliver a sermon, marched into his church down to the sanctuary, found Becket more or less preparing for his sermon and for the communion that would be following it, and they had a heated verbal exchange with him. There's definitely a play on words as some of this develops, and I won't bore you with all of what was said there, but one of the most interesting comments to me is that the knights demanded to know why Becket did not serve the Lord. And of course, the knights mean their feudal lord, Henry, and Becket says, "I do serve the Lord," of course referring to God. And this kind of heated exchange went back and forth, and at one point Becket called Henry II a quote-unquote whoremongerer. Becket knew this was true. Becket had been a part of the whoremongering or womanizing. So when he said that, the knights jumped on him, beat him, and beheaded him. The head was presented to Henry II, who promptly vomited and said this was not what he intended at all. And as a result of this, Becket's popularity grew even more. Henry II became an extremely unpopular figure. Becket was actually proclaimed a saint in the Roman Catholic Church because of his transformation. What the monks found at Becket's death when they saw his beheaded body, when they came out, heard all of the commotion, when the monks came out, they found underneath Becket's robe that he was wearing a hair shirt, and this was a torture device worn by religious fanatics. It was a shirt made of animal hair, like goat hair. It was really scratchy and irritating and usually had fleas and lice in it. And that was the point. You wore this shirt underneath your clothing. You didn't tell anybody you had it on, and it was punishment or self-mortification, punishing oneself for sinful ways. And so when people saw that Becket had on this hair shirt, a torture device, that he was punishing himself daily for his past ways, they were even more profoundly impacted by the change in this man, from a partier, a drunkard, a womanizing kind of guy, to a complete and total reformed and truly Christian individual. So Becket was proclaimed a saint. And in the famous English novel work, The Canterbury Tales, you might remember, by Geoffrey Chaucer, it is to the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury that the pilgrims are making their way towards in this story. So what happened to Henry as a result? Well, his unpopularity grew to horrible proportions, so much so that his son Richard came to him and he said, "All right, Dad," this is in 1189, and he says to him, "All right, Dad, either you can step down and give me the throne, or I'm going to wage war against you and kill you. Take your pick here." Henry was so distraught by this point over the loss of his friend, which had happened. Now, follow me here. Becket's killed in 1170. Henry doesn't die until 1189. For 19 years, he carried around guilt and the hatred of the English people. And for his son to react this way against him was the last straw. Henry fell ill. And historians have long wondered, why did he suddenly become ill? Is there some sort of foul play here or what? We don't know. All we know is that from the records of the time, Henry is described as dying of a broken heart, that his son's rebellion against him was too much, that he died from heartbreak. Henry became ill very quickly and was on his deathbed and was in and out of consciousness. And when he looked around the room at one point, just before he died, he saw that surrounding him were his illegitimate children. And he reached out his hand to one of them. And this illegitimate son jumped up and grabbed the hand of Henry II, and he said, "Yes, Father." And Henry II asked the question, "Where are Richard and John?" Those are his only two legitimate sons. And this illegitimate son says, "They are not here, Father." And Henry says, "Well, they're the real bastards." And I just love that. I think that's a great play on words. So, in this struggle between Henry II and Thomas Becket, we see yet again church versus state, a power struggle. This one did not end well for either man.